One of the most asked questions is, why is there evil in the world? Why is there suffering? We don't seem to find a logical answer for this question. We've been trying to answer it for generations and generations, and we stand here today in 2017, and we are still searching. We don't know. I think that traditional methods have failed to address this question adequately so that we can rest assured we know exactly why there is evil in the world. Why do children suffer? Why is there war? Why are there diseases? Why are there volcanoes, tsunamis? Why is there war? Why do people go on a killing rampage? Why do we have massacres? Why did the Holocaust happen? And we do this by looking up to the sky and asking our question from what we perceive to be God, because we understand that there is a creator, and this creator has told us he is in charge, and he brought us to life for a purpose. But then we don't seem to understand, if he is all powerful and capable and loving and compassionate and able, why does he allow evil to exist at all? What is the point of this? What is the point of bringing us to life and then having us suffer? I've heard religious scholars, faith leaders try to explain this question in a few different ways, but ultimately no good explanation has come from any of those. Some of them tell us that this is because we have sinned and we need to pay and for our sins, and that we need to be punished and judged and all of that before we go to heaven. So this is essentially a place of punishment for us. There isn't supposed to be really any joy because we are guilty. We have to go through our punishment and then be allowed into heaven forever and to live in peace and harmony and bliss and all of that. But some others will tell us that ultimately we don't know. This is a part of God's plan, and God works in mysterious ways. He must have his own reasons. This is a question that was asked by Elie Wiesel, the late Elie Wiesel, who passed away a few years ago, who was a concentration camp prisoner during the Second World War. And he was also a faith leader, a Jewish faith leader. And he asked the same question, and he explains in his one of his books that while he was a prisoner in a concentration camp, they were debating this question amongst themselves, the Jewish prisoners. There was a lot of debate about, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to defend ourselves? Are we supposed to just basically accept our fate because this must be all part of God's plan? And the elders were saying, yes, we must have sinned, and this is part of God's plan, and he is putting us through this torment for a reason, for our own good. But there was a younger generation that were not finding this good enough an answer. They were standing in the middle of all of this murder and mayhem and chaos, not finding really any logical reason for children to be murdered in the way they were, for their mothers, for the young, for the old. And so a school of thought came about that no, God says that you have free will and you need to defend yourself. So that was a different way of looking at evil, that there is evil in the world, but it's up to us to fight it. We are supposed to do our duty and prove to God that we are able and we are on the side of good. We are going to put up a fight against evil. So this is during the Second World War, during a time when the Jewish population of Europe was being put through mass murder, essentially. And this question was constantly resonating. What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to defend ourselves or just put up with this? If we look at this question from the elders' point of view, that we are supposed to be going through our suffering, then we might look at the Nazi captors and the concentration camp commandants and all of the staff as doing God's work. Are they doing God's work by putting these people through their torment? Are they supposed to be, following a plan? Because if there is punishment that is exacted out or planned, there is a party that needs to be dishing out this punishment. You need to have, if you have captives, you need to have captors. You need to have people who hold the keys. So are they not guilty of what they're doing? Are we absolving them of their guilt, their actions, their evil actions? So are we supposed to say, well, evil exists because God allows it, because we are supposed to go through this punishment? But how do you explain a 3-year-old with cancer? What is the 3-year-old being punished for? How did this 3-year-old offend God so badly that they need to be put through this torment? What about birth defects? What about people who are born with ailments and diseases, life-threatening? Some of them perish within the first 5 years of life. How do you explain and justify a loving God, a creator, but then again, the 3-year-old with this disease? This is where I think religion fails, established religion fails to tell us. I remember soon after the Sandy Hook massacre, the TV cameras went to the scene, and I think it was a couple of days after, during one of the interviews, the TV reporter was asking a couple of the community faith leaders the same question. How can God allow this to happen? How could they have any answer at that moment when these little kindergartners were gunned down in this evil fashion? How could they stand up and say, well, actually God condoned it and they were being punished or tested or whatever? And so the answer was, well, it's not a good time right now. But the reporter asked a second time, when is a good time? But the answer was the same, it's not a good time right now. So if we are looking at the world, if we look at our lives, within this framework that there's supposed to be this creator who is all loving and he wants the best for us, but then couple that together with the reality of our lives and kind of try to make sense of the evil in the world, we do ask the question, why do you allow this to happen? Or perhaps is God himself evil as well as good? So he's not all good, that's why he allows evil to happen. But the answer that I found ultimately was that we do have free will, which means that God does not direct every action that we take, which means that the Nazis chose to become who they were, and they chose to build concentration camps, not because they were directed by the hand of God, and not because God condoned what they were doing. The people who ultimately became prisoners in those concentration camps, they were not being tested, they were not being punished. God didn't want them to suffer the way that they did. But this is what we do. This is what people do. So I would say that in the face of evil, we do have a duty to fight. We do have a duty to stand up. Instead of looking up to the sky and thinking, someone needs to intervene here. Someone needs to stop this camp from being built. That someone is us. We need to stop the camp from being built. We need to stand up and we need to announce evil where we find it. And we have a duty to defend ourselves, defend our loved ones. And we are not supposed to accept someone coming to our house, holding us captive, kidnapping us, essentially taking us to a certain place to have us all murdered, burnt in ovens, and for us to accept that as that's God's work. We're supposed to be suffering in this way. God doesn't want you to suffer in this way. God wants you to choose between what is evil and what is compassionate. You are supposed to choose compassion. The thing about life on earth and what I have found so far is that our earth essentially serves as an opportunity to choose between one of these two. God is hoping that we are going to choose compassion. But without being presented with evil, there is no choice to be made. If all is compassion and is bliss, and if we live our lives amongst loving, compassionate people who never would harm us or do anything wrong or display anything that is not compassion, we're not going to have a choice to make. It's like a fish in the water. There is no choice for the fish. It's in the water, but once it's out of the water, it knows that there is a choice to be made. Outside of the water or inside. The natural state of being is compassion. Compassion is where we feel the most at peace. We are blissful. We are joyful in compassion. Anything outside of compassion, I term as evil, with different flavors. It could be anything from unkind to barbaric. But anything outside of compassion is essentially evil. So when we ask the question, why is there evil? I think we're asking, why isn't there compassion? Or why isn't there more compassion or all compassion? Because all of us, we suppose that there is supposed to be all compassion. There is supposed to be all love. People are not supposed to get murdered. They're not supposed to get tortured. There's not supposed to be a concentration camp. They are not supposed to have these diseases. And little children are not supposed to have cancer. These are the things we presuppose when we ask this question and we ask God, why is there suffering? There shouldn't be any suffering. But the reason for suffering to happen is because we are supposed to make a choice. Now, we look at children, helpless children, innocent children, and we ask ourselves, well, a child suffering, what is that supposed to do? What purpose is that supposed to serve? How do you go to the children's hospital and you find kids with terminal illnesses? What purpose is that supposed to serve? I think that particular example, that tragedy that we face, is supposed to elicit a compassionate response from within us. This is what's supposed to happen. When we are faced with evil, when we are faced with suffering, we are supposed to grow more compassionate. This is the response that the world or God or this plan wants to elicit. And we know we have a choice. We can get angry and we can get combative and we can cultivate hate inside of us. We can do that. But we are supposed to go the way of compassion. We are supposed to find compassion for ourselves and for the person who is suffering. So every time that we come face to face with suffering, we have a choice to make. Each suffering that we come across essentially is a question mark. And the question mark is, how do you respond? When you come across someone living on the street, do you just pass them by and ignore them and never mind? Or does that compel you to stop and attend and find out and help and assist if you could? That is the compassionate thing to do. So why is there suffering in the world? Why is there evil in the world? First, it's because we need to make a conscious choice. Without being faced with evil, without being faced with suffering, we don't have any choices to make. The purpose of creation is for us to make that choice. Ultimately, for us to arrive at that one choice, the one true choice, which is compassion. We are supposed to walk away from hatred, from revenge, from anger, and arrive at compassion, which is what God is. God is compassion, and God is love. The world we live in is separate from what we know to be heaven. Heaven is supposed to be bliss. It's supposed to be love, harmony. There is no conflict in heaven. No one suffers in heaven. But once you're outside of that, this is the scene where you touch and you feel suffering and evil. And the choice that you are supposed to make is what the place where there is bliss and there is harmony and there is love and there is joy. That is what you're supposed to pick. Is it possible to live in our world where there is suffering and evil, but in bliss and compassion and in harmony? Absolutely, it is possible. How is it possible? We have to choose it. It's very possible. We can choose to live in bliss and harmony and in love and compassion all the time. Or we can choose differently. But again, this stage, the world stage, presents us an opportunity to sense, to feel, to touch, to smell evil and suffering and anything outside of compassion so that we can make this choice. So we're not being punished. We're not being tormented because our ancestors did something wrong. We are not being tested. This is not a test. People might say, well, you are being tested because you are making a choice. But you can't really fail the test because there is one choice to make, which is compassion. And you have opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. Every day you leave your house, wherever that you go. If you're observant and if you can really be tuned in, you're going to find many opportunities where you can have a compassionate response, as opposed to an angry or selfish or judgmental or any other kind of a negative response that you can have. So again, getting back to this question of why is there suffering, why is there evil in the world? Again, we're coming from this presumption that there isn't supposed to be any. And you know what? To some degree, that is right. There isn't really supposed to be any. But because by virtue of us being on this planet, making these choices, we do create evil on the face of this planet. We do make these choices. I sometimes think, again, going back to this example of the Second World War, you know, at every turn, when Nazis were coming to power, there were choices being made. These leaders could have chosen differently, but they chose not to. So they chose something that led to catastrophe ultimately, because they believed that that was really, you know, racism, that Nazism, mass murder, that was the way to go. Did that succeed? No. Compassion is the only thing that succeeds ultimately. Hatred doesn't succeed. This is another lesson that's before us for us to learn, that ultimately, and it is true that love conquers, it does, and compassion just supersedes everything else. But nonetheless, we do have these choices to make, and we do come into life to be faced with these choices, to be faced with suffering, for us to watch newsreels from faraway lands showing us suffering, showing us cluster bombs and wars and chemical attacks. We see, again, we watch a newsreel from a faraway land. We can't just pick up and leave everything behind and just go over there and start to help people. That's not practical, and that's not really what is meant to happen. We are supposed to become more compassionate in our own lives. We are supposed to behave more compassionately as a result in our own lives. So we witness the suffering, you know, far away from us. And it is true that we're not really directly affecting them in any positive way, perhaps. But at the very least, the image and the experience of this suffering and the tragedy can translate positively within our own lives. We can be more loving towards our own children. We can be more loving towards ourselves. We can be less combative with life altogether. Every day, we don't have to view life as another battle in the war that life is. We can be more compassionate. We can be more understanding. I remember a picture. This photograph. It's a famous Vietnam era photograph of this South Vietnamese colonel, I think, as he is about to shoot this North Vietnamese soldier, and a photographer is capturing what is going on. And you can ask yourself, why doesn't this Almighty God somehow change this man's mind and say, put down the gun and do not shoot? Or he can make this gun jam altogether and not fire. Why doesn't he do that? Why isn't he more merciful towards this victim, this person who's just about to have his life taken away from him in such a violent fashion? Why not? Why not, stop any atrocity from happening? Why not intervene on our behalf? Why not part the sea? Why not do the same thing you did for Moses when he asked for help? Why not come to our help now? We are not any less important. My child is not any less important. My suffering is not any less important. Everybody's suffering is important to them. Everybody's equally is important to them. So why doesn't God love me the same way that he loved, apparently, Moses and the captives out of Egypt, where he led them to safety and he intervened and he drowned the army of the Pharaoh, in pursuit. I think that particular viewpoint belongs to what I term as the Abrahamic thoughts and Abrahamic religions. That is the God of Abraham. And the God of Abraham gave birth to Judaism, gave birth to Christianity, and gave birth to Islam. I think somewhere around 70% of the planet is covered by these three major religions, I think. So there's a lot of belief in the God of Abraham, and it's well expected if he intervenes from time to time, on behalf of different people, why not me? And I think we are right to ask this question. Why don't you intervene and stop this particular evil from happening? And this was a question that was being asked again in the concentration camps. Or in Warsaw, when during the Second World War, these atrocities were being committed. They were rightfully being asked, well, why don't you intervene now? We are just as badly off. We are victims too. Our kids are dying, so why don't you intervene now? But there was no intervention. There was no answer. There was no sound. And these people were being massacred. And it was two opposing armies that ultimately defeated Nazis and liberated the camps and, the people that were left. It was no divine intervention. There was nothing from the sky that came down and stopped, the carnage. It was actually people deciding, we are going to stand up to this, and we are not going to let this happen. That is what brought about the end of that particular chapter, dark chapter in our history. But people continue to ask. And I think we mostly address God when we are in trouble or when we are suffering. I don't know how many of us would remember a God when we're, happy and joyful and, we are lucky or everything is going well. I think mostly we do turn to him, perhaps like a father or father figure perhaps, but someone, when we hit a dead end and we are frustrated, we need help, that's when we ask for help. Can you intervene on our behalf? But I can tell you that most people will tell you not much happens when you ask for that kind of help. You don't really see a hand coming down from the sky to intervene and to make things right one way or another. That doesn't really happen.